My name is Stephen Nairn. I'm the director of the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies, and it's my pleasure to open the second annual Geoffrey Hartman Fellowship Symposium. I hope this day will prove to be an enriching and productive one. I'd like to thank the Fortunoff family, and in particular Joshua and Esther, for being here today, and all of the other donors, Blaustein, Libby, and Ross families, and dozens of others, large and small, who help make the archive's work possible. The Fortunoff Archive's Hartman Fellowship Program, now in its second year, was established in honor of Geoffrey Hartman, passed away on March 14th, 2016. An eminent professor of comparative literature at Yale and the Fortunoff Video Archive's longtime faculty advisor, Geoffrey's vision and leadership helped build the Fortunoff Archive into the institution that it is today. The fellowship, now in its second year, is a 12-month fellowship, postdoctoral fellowship, for a single new PhD. And this year we expanded the program to include a joint fellowship with the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute. And I'd like to thank Eva Kovacs and her husband Janusz for coming all the way from Vienna to be here today to celebrate this initial VWI Fortunoff Joint Fellowship. Eva is the research program director at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute. The purpose of the Hartman Fellowship is to provide scholars with an opportunity to pursue deep research in the Fortunoff collection, to advance their own scholarship, as well as to produce an annotated critical edition of a testimony. Now, this critical edition is a testimony transcript with annotations and an introductory chapter. These annotations in this chapter are designed to illuminate the complexities of the narrative and to include additional information and context to help readers better understand or grasp the complexity of a document like a testimony from our collection. The introductory essay, is designed to focus on the significance of this testimony for Holocaust history in general, as well as the fellows' scholarship in particular. And our hope is that our fellows will also, after leaving here, serve as ambassadors for the collection as they continue to use it in their research and teaching at the next institution that they call home. The critical editions, I hope, unlock testimony and make them accessible to a broader readership, and encourage both scholarly and educational use of these resources at various levels. We have two presentations today, and then each of them will be followed by Q&A, and we'll take a break between them as well so people can get refreshments. And the first speaker will be Sari Siegel, who is our second Geoffrey H. Hartman Fellow. Sari has an MA and a PhD in history from the University of Southern California, and she received her BA from Yale University. Bula, bula. The Geoffrey H. Hartman Postdoctoral Fellowship brings her back. She earned her BA in 2006. In addition to receiving numerous grants and fellowships, she has been a fellow in residence at the Center for Holocaust Studies at the Institute for Contemporary History. She's been a fellow at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. She has presented her research on Jewish prisoner physicians at many conferences and workshops in the U.S. and abroad. Sari will be presenting her work on the testimony of Edith F. So please join me in... Oh, Esther, sorry. Esther F. So please join me in welcoming Sari.
If it were Edith, I'd have to say that. Thank you for the introduction, Stephen. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank you for the fellowship opportunity and to thank the donors who have created this position in the memory of the very important scholar, Geoffrey Hartman. It has been a pleasure to be a part of the Fortunoff Video Archive, especially as it marks 40 years since the taping of the first 4 testimonies with this special series of events. Thanks also go to Christy Tomacek for her assistance with the clips, and to Deborah Bush for her assistance with just about everything else. Esther was born Estera Nissenhaus on August 16, 1908, in Łódź or Lodz, Poland. On October 9, 1991, when she was 83 years old, Esther sat for an interview with Yashael Perry, at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York. Esther grew up in a traditional Jewish home, which kept kosher and observed Shabbat, but was not Hasidic. She was fluent in Yiddish and Polish and attended a private Jewish school with Polish as the language of instruction. Unlike the majority of her peers, she was not affiliated with youth groups or political parties. As a result of living in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood and attending a Jewish school, she had limited encounters with non-Jewish Poles and did not personally experience anti-Semitism. As a result of the numerous clauses that severely limited Jews' access to medical education within Poland, Esther traveled to France. She returned to Łódź with her medical degree in 1933. Interested in pediatrics, she worked at a children's hospital, but then switched to a position as a doctor for a workers' union. Shortly before the German invasion of Poland, Esther married a school principal whom she last saw when he left for duty as an officer in the Polish army. He was captured shortly thereafter, and as a Jewish POW, eventually sent to the Włodawa Ghetto, from which he was later deported to Sobibor. Esther and other residents of Łódź, renamed Litzmannstadt by German officials, were forced to move into the city's ghetto when it was first established in February 1940. She worked in one of the ghetto's hospitals and as a member of the ghetto's emergency medical service, making house calls in response to reported medical emergencies. She lived in the ghetto with her mother and one of her brothers, all of whom were deported together to Auschwitz when the ghetto was liquidated in August 1944. Over those 4.5 years, she and nearly all ghetto inhabitants suffered from hunger, cold, and fear of deportations. This image shows the doctors, nurses, and emergency personnel of the hospital on, going to try to do the Polish, Łagiewnicka Street. It is unclear whether she is pictured here. In August 1944, during the final liquidation of the Litzmannstadt ghetto, Esther was deported, along with her brother and mother, to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where she spent 5 days in a section designated for Jews to be transferred to other camps and utilized for slave labor. When a call went out for doctors, she identified herself and was subsequently sent to work as a doctor in Guben, a subcamp connected to the Gross-Rosen concentration camp. Located on the current border between Germany and Poland, this camp housed young women assigned to work on radio equipment for the German Air Force. After the camp was evacuated due to the approach of the Soviet Army in early February 1945, she traveled several days in an uncovered truck and arrived at Bergen-Belsen on February 15th. She received an assignment from the head prisoner physician, but came down with typhus within 2 weeks and was still recovering when the British Army liberated the camp on April 15th, 1945. She moved a short distance to the Bergen-Belsen displaced persons camp, which was established in nearby army barracks. Once she recovered, she provided medical attention to her fellow survivors. Not desiring to return to her native Poland, she decided to volunteer to be among a group of DPs to go to Sweden for further rehabilitation. They departed in July 1945, and she continued her medical work in Sweden, treating Jewish DPs. Her work came to a halt, however, once her fellow DPs had recovered and dispersed. She subsequently benefited from the kindness of a prominent Jewish doctor in Stockholm and worked in his forensic medicine lab. Over this period, she entered into correspondence with her first husband's best friend, who was living in New York. Shortly after he arrived in Sweden to visit her, they were married. and in May 1947, she followed him to New York, where she eventually set up a medical practice in pediatrics. She recorded her testimony for the Fortunoff Video Archive on October 9, 1991, and then for the Show-Off Foundation Visual History Archive on January 30th, 1995. So, why did I choose Esther's testimony? Given that my dissertation studied Jewish prisoner physicians in Nazi camps, and that my next project will examine Holocaust survivors' provision of medical care to fellow survivors in the early post-war years, Esther's testimony seemed like an ideal fit. After all, she served as a doctor in Guben and utilized her medical training to help survivors in Bergen-Belsen and then in DP camps in Sweden. Upon further exploration, though, her testimony did not yield very much insight into her medical work in these venues. Nevertheless, I decided to work with HVT 2033 because, as a result of my dissertation research, I was attuned to a few threads that appear throughout Esther's testimony. Furthermore, the threads align with my methodological approach, the simultaneous investigation of Jewish doctors on micro and macro levels. Because Jewish doctors' medical training provided them with knowledge and the skill set required to treat the sick and injured in ghettos and camps, their recruitment and/or protection offers, at least to some extent, insight into the value accorded to the lives of their prospective patients. In turn, one can discern dynamics between the pursuits of two different yet overlapping initiatives: the exploitation of the Jewish labor force and the extermination of European Jewry. This line of reasoning is not without exceptions, of course, as Jewish doctors were also mobilized for the benefit of German officials' own health. However, my dissertation research revealed that this motivation was generally secondary to the goal of exploiting the Jewish labor force. I can address this caveat as well as the impact of insufficient medical supplies in the Q&A. So how can Esther's testimony offer insight into the macro-level dynamics between these two major initiatives? The first three sites of her internment are crucial. The question of preserving or liquidating the Litzmannstadt ghetto was one of the key flashpoints between the German officials most intent on extermination and those more invested in harnessing Jewish labor power for financial gain and/or for the benefit of the German war effort. Esther's references to official measures taken to preserve the lives of ghetto doctors and to reinforce the medical staff, more specifically, the instructions to perimeter guards not to shoot those wearing particular medical insignia, and the facilitation of the recruitment of additional doctors from the Warsaw Ghetto in mid-1941, communicate that doctors had value to German officials as possible preservers of the labor force. Furthermore, the ghetto's Warszawą location is important, as this Reich-annexed region of Western Poland was the manifestation, or saw the manifestation, of this conflict in the simultaneous proliferation of forced labor camps for Jews in 1941, 42, and 43, and the operation of the Nazis' first extermination site, Chełmno, beginning in December 1941. My dissertation research reveals that each level of the civil government in the Warszawą, including municipal authorities in charge of the Litzmannstadt ghetto, as well as officials in Berlin and German businessmen in public and private industry, either instigated or facilitated the transfer of Jewish doctors from Berlin to forced labor camps for Jews in the name of preserving the labor force. When Esther arrived in Birkenau in August 1944, and during the preceding late spring and summer months, the camp's crematoria were working at and beyond capacity as transports arrived from the Lodz ghetto and from Hungary. At the same time, however, New sections of the camp were established to hold thousands of new arrivals who were soon to be designated for transport to hundreds of camps to help the German war effort. So, while her mother was immediately dispatched to the gas chamber, Esther was among those sent to the so-called transit camps within Birkenau, and she was transferred to Guben only 5 days later. Her transfer from Birkenau to serve as a doctor for Jews working in a factory manufacturing airplane radio parts demonstrates a clear interest in the preservation of Jews' labor capacity. The camp's location within the Reich proper draws further attention to the importance of the Jewish labor force, as the Jews were brought back into the territory that was previously declared to be and was meant to stay Judenrein, cleansed of Jews. Guben was just one of around 100 Gross-Rosen subcamps, dozens of which contained prisoner populations comprised mostly or entirely of Jews. Once she arrived, her experience communicates that, at least to some extent, the German official in charge of the camp had an interest in the medical treatment of the inmates.
I remember Siegel that I was back.
Is the volume okay? Yeah. Would it be from the computer itself?
You can do it from the computer, but you can also do it from here. Let's see.
Yeah, it didn't sound loud enough.
Let's try that again.
I remember
There we go.
Sibaldine
Thank
that
you.
I was tiring from Sibaldine like an aspirin. So I caught, like holding on something, Sibaldine. All right, I read the one word. The inn gave me the holding, and I wrote aspirin. Oh, so I wrote the two things. And sometimes a minute later or whatever, I have cotton, alcohol, iodine, and that's all. Maybe another word I don't remember. And she came, and she says to me, "That's all what you ask right now?"
Evidently, the female officer in charge of the camp was prepared to provide more supplies, as she asked Esther if the doctor had listed all the supplies she required. Her experience echoes my findings related to Jewish prisoner physicians within the industrial subcamps of Auschwitz. Surviving doctors report that, on a variety of occasions, SS medical orderlies or doctors obtained requested medical equipment or medications, and the importance of the Jewish doctors to the industrial program is clear from their transfers from Birkenau to the subcamps and from one subcamp to another. I would also like to draw attention to a micro-thread that runs throughout Esther's testimony: the conduct of Jewish functionaries and the issue of judgment. Although admittedly problematic and thus a possible topic for discussion in the Q&A, I'm offering the following tentative definition of Jewish functionaries: Jews who held privileged positions and carried out tasks that, in one way or another, and to varying extents, facilitated the achievement of the German officials' aims. As such, they existed in what Holocaust survivor and author Primo Levi calls the gray zone, a, quote, poorly defined space where the two camps of masters and servants both diverge and converge, end quote. Recognizing the moral ambiguity of functionaries' circumstances, Levi cautioned against judgment of such people, writing, quote, "This gray zone possesses an incredibly complicated internal structure and contains within itself enough to confuse our need to judge," end quote. Esther's testimony offers an entry point to discuss several examples of gray zone figures who, until relatively recently, have presented scholars with a taboo topic. The Jewish police in the ghetto, or the Ordnungsdienst, literally the order service, is one group of functionaries whom Esther discusses. Interestingly, as you will see, Yashael Perry, the interviewer, presses Esther to pronounce a judgment, which is actually a breach of Fortunoff Video Archive's interviewer protocol. Esther, on the other hand, chooses to suspend judgment, just as Levy suggests.
There are some people blaming the behavior of the Jewish police in the ghetto. Do you have some opinion about it?
I have my opinion, but I don't know how to explain it, because if some people, I say that I prefer to die and not do these things, but others say that this is self-preservation. So this is a question of, I have to think of it much more, because I wasn't in this position where I was to do, I would call it the dirty things. I did what I could. I didn't do more than I did. And I couldn't save everybody's life. But the other things, let's say they collected the people to the gathering places to be deported. Now this was an order from Rumkowski, and Rumkowski got the order from the German. So if you were a policeman, you could have said, I don't want to do it. So you would have gone, and you had a family. So now I don't want to go into this. It's too complicated and too hard to accuse. I don't know.
Evidently, she recognizes that moral calculus cannot account for what amounts to a choiceless choice, which calls for the consideration of the officers' families' welfare and the harm that might come to them if the officers were to disobey orders. She takes a similarly hesitant approach to judgment in her discussion of one of the most controversial figures in the history of the Holocaust, Mordechai Chaim Rumkowski, elder of the Jews, or Judenälteste, of the Litzmannstadt Ghetto.
I don't know how right he was, how wrong he was, because he obeyed the German. And maybe if he would not obey, would nobody remain in the ghetto. But if you want to be honorable and stand, like to say, die on your feet and not to live on your knees, we shouldn't have had this. But this is good for individuals, but not to. So the history will judge him how right or how wrong he was. But being in the ghetto, he abused his power too. He was an older man, and he once was something in the hospital. I didn't work in this because I lived on one side of the bridge, and the doctors who lived on the other side worked in the other hospital. It was something with the nurses. He was going and even hit one nurse, another nurse, and so the doctor who was on chief objected. So he always hit him too. So these were inner things, painful to mention too. But history will judge this. I am not going to say what was right and what was wrong. But there was a lot of abuses and a lot of things which shouldn't have happened. But as you say, by it is self-preservation. I am not going into psychology right now. I don't think so. We have, and I don't want to even be the judge of all this.
No.
She believes judgment should be deferred until history renders a verdict. Yet by 1991, when she recorded these words, nearly 50 years after the ghetto's liquidation, when would such a verdict be pronounced, and who would be in a position to do so? Why the need for judgment in the first place? Again, Perry asks Esther to pass judgment on a group of functionaries. But this time, when it comes to the ghetto doctors, there is no hesitation.
How would you, looking backward of what you experienced as a doctor with your colleagues and the circumstances you had there in the ghetto, how would you judge their action there of the doctors in the ghetto? The doctors, how did they behave and how did they act there in these circumstances?
I would say very decent. And everybody tried, you see, it's hard to say to try and to do, because there are two difficult things. We had paralyzed hands, what we did, but nobody abused anything. But as far as I know, and I am sure there wasn't, to abuse in any way patients or neglect patients or to collaborate with German, not at all. Not at all, none of them.
Perhaps she was not aware, or no longer recalls, but there were ghetto doctors who, under coercion, assisted Nazis in mass murder. Nazi officials required Jewish doctors to perform medical examinations on people on deportation lists to determine whether they were appropriate candidates for the fate that awaited them at a particular transport's assigned destination, either a forced labor camp or Chelmno. As a result, ghetto doctors like Arnold Mostovich could only protect a few individuals by finding them undesirable candidates for the transport. In other words, he and the other doctors who were coerced into carrying out this process had to decide who would be exempt from the transports. And in doing so, they had to determine who would live and who would die. While there was significant coercive pressure on Mostovich, it was largely indirect, originating with German officials and conveyed to him via the so-called Jewish self-government in the ghetto. Circumstances were different in camps, however, where the SS performed direct supervision and thus exerted the coercive force directly. Although Esther's testimony does not afford much insight into that dynamic, she does discuss an act of resistance.
Once in a while came a German official to check house there, and I kept a little bit of double bookkeeping for him. I showed the temperature and everything a little bit on the normal side, and the real I didn't show them because the majority had TB. I don't know if you should know it. He didn't examine, he only took it. So I tried to say.
Through my work on Jewish prisoner physicians, I have devised a framework to aid conceptualization and discussion of these functionaries and potentially other functionaries' behavior, the coercion-resistance spectrum. Unlike Levy's gray zone, it sets acts of resistance firmly in the discussion, and it emphasizes the dynamic of coercion as opposed to the loaded and largely inappropriate term collaboration. The word spectrum is not indicative of an array between polar opposites according to which a particular act could be situated and categorized. Instead, it serves to draw attention to the wide range of possible courses of action. The thrust of the model is what I call historicizing the gray zone and drawing attention to the shifts in behavior and the changes in environmental factors that influence a prisoner physician's room for maneuver. So in Esther's case, the combination of the infrequency of the SS doctor's visits and his lack of interest in personally examining her patients enabled her to keep 2 sets of medical records and thereby potentially save the lives of her patients with tuberculosis, a diagnosis that could have been a death sentence. Given that Esther's testimony offers limited insight into her work as a prisoner physician at Guben, and because typhus largely kept her from medical work at Bergen-Belsen, I am not able to approach my introductory essay as I had hoped when I first embarked on this critical edition project. I simply do not have enough content to mobilize the coercion-resistance spectrum framework in my discussion of her testimony. However, as I have demonstrated here, I am able to bring my dissertation research to bear in another way. The insights I have gained through my macro-level work on prisoner physicians enable me to read between the lines of Esther's testimony and address how her presence as a doctor, as well as the events and places she describes, sheds light on the interaction between 2 central German initiatives during the Holocaust: exploitation and extermination. In other words, I am able to address the testimony's relationship to the macro-scale narrative of the Holocaust. As such, I can point out how the history behind the testimony challenges the outdated intentionalist narrative that, based on the following, Perry evidently espouses. He asks, quote, looking backward again, about the starvation and the illness and sickness and the conditions in the ghetto. Do you think that all this was planned ahead by the Germans, the situation in the ghetto, before the liquidation? End quote. Shortly thereafter, he adds, quote, I read somewhere that they did. They planned it purposely this way, end quote. Consequently, as a historiography of the functionalist-intentionalist debate has given way to more nuanced studies, my critical edition essay will, among other things, introduce Jewish doctors as a lens through which to view macro-level developments. Thanks for your attention. I look forward to comments and questions.
Questions for Sari?
Maybe I missed something, but you talked about Dr. Moscovich.
Mm-hmm.
Could you,
Elaborate?
yeah, because it's like, I don't have a context.
Yeah, so he, as a doctor in the Lodz Ghetto, wrote a memoir. So he sheds
Okay.
the most light on what went on there from the medical team.
Okay.
So I can let you know about that later if you
No,
want.
I do know about it. I just,
Oh,
I
okay.
wasn't
Yeah,
calculating.
okay.
My brain was dead for a minute.
Any questions?
Joshua?
What for you were the most surprising revelations from your studies? What were the things that you thought you might find and turned out different?
Generally, when I read the summary of her Holocaust trajectory and what she did, it seemed like I had hit on something golden. This is exactly what I do and what I'm going to do, in that she was a prisoner physician, and she also worked as a doctor in a ghetto. And then she worked as a doctor in DP camps, something that I'm going to hopefully do with my next project. So that was just right there for me. And then I realized there is a little meat there, but not very much. So how can I bring something else to the table here? So I can't really engage in, as I said, the coercion-resistance spectrum framework because there's not enough there. It would be too much of a reach. However, it occurred to me, wait, I have dealt with some of these issues in terms of the macro scale. She does provide insights that I can point out. Odds are people aren't necessarily going to pick up on, oh, she mentions that the doctors were supposed to wear certain caps so they wouldn't get shot at. And Rumkowski brought back some doctors, brought in some doctors from Warsaw. To me, that signals, wait a sec. They want to protect doctors. The officials want to protect doctors, and they facilitated the transfer of doctors from the Warsaw Ghetto to the Łódź Ghetto. Why? So these are small clues that draw my attention towards a larger fact. Of course, by pointing this out, I'm in no way negating the horrific circumstances that the Jews lived in the Łódź Ghetto. But the fact that these tiny details come out of the testimony, it says something. And generally, when we're talking about the horrible conditions, it wasn't entirely brought on by Bibov, the head of the ghetto administration. There were plenty of people on other levels working at cross purposes and for their own enrichment that took food, that took medication, that was meant for the Jews. Again, horrible circumstances. Odds are the Nazis were fine with mass death, but there was something there that they wanted to do. And I see that as preserving doctors' lives and in some cases letting medication enter the ghetto and providing them with minimal supplies to keep the workers alive. That's how Rumkowski kept the ghetto going. It was important to the war effort. So that gives me something to put in the micro. I mean, in the macro. Okay.
Did you look at any other doctor or prisoner physicians in the collection, and if so, why again Esther, if others had more meat? The first part of the question, though, did you look at other physicians, and did you find anything else that would be useful for your research?
So there are testimonies of prisoner physicians. However, they weren't in the regions that I specialized in. So I wasn't able to bring to bear the knowledge of the Warthegau, for example, which is the location of the Łódź Ghetto. I had a case study on doctors in the forced labor camps for Jews in the Warthegau. So I have some grasp of the mechanisms going on there. What are the dynamics? And I also have a case study on doctors in the industrial subcamps of Birkenau, which is parallel to Guben. So Guben's relationship to Grossrosen. So these fit better, although the meat wasn't there. I felt like I could bring more of what I specialize in, to some extent, to bear on the topic, whereas other doctors were in the general government, an area that I would love to study more, but I haven't gotten there yet. So that's why I chose Esther. And still, even though I can't bring what I thought I could to it, I still think, and of course you can weigh in, whether what I'm bringing is substantial enough in terms of the idea of macro level insights and micro level activities and judgments.
Of course, the biggest, to me, biggest irony here is that by preserving life, she's helping the German war effort, which in the end would have brought the destruction of everybody. And I don't know if that's discussed a lot, at least in my reading of the Holocaust. And of course, the biggest problem was starvation. I mean, people were dying of starvation, which she could not impact, I guess, unless that was something that she brought up to the people in the camp, that if you don't feed people, you know, of course, then they have this endless line of people, not endless, but so, I mean, I don't know how much this is discussed. I mean, it's discussed in terms of Rumkowski, in terms of his efforts, which preserves himself, but this is also going on at this other level.
You're absolutely right. In fact, Esther does mention that her efforts and as a doctor for workers and what the workers were doing themselves could be viewed as collaboration. She actually mobilizes that word, which was so fascinating to me, because there was an awareness that the effort they put in on the doctor's part to save the lives of the workers who were helping the German war effort, which, as you pointed out, would keep the war going, would pose greater problems to a larger Jewish population, that was an ethical issue. So in the growing scholarship on resistance, there's discussion of people sabotaging in these workplaces. So there was awareness, and some of the workers tried to go in and sabotage to hurt the war effort. As for the prisoner physicians, of the ones that I studied, the memoirs I read, the testimonies they gave, there was some awareness that what they were doing was potentially contributing to prolonging the war. But at the same time, they were also adhering to the Hippocratic Oath. Their job as doctors was to take care of patients. So just doing what they're supposed to do had a bigger impact, but the important thing is trying to help the person in front of them to the greatest extent possible.
Was there anything particular about Esther's testimony, the fact that she was a female doctor and a pediatrician, that was different from other testimonies that you looked at? Or does it put her along with other female doctors? I know it's more a deeper research topic, but just wondering what you thought of that, whether you did or not.
It's something that crept into my mind when I was making the decision. The other testimonies of doctors were men. So generally, I'm just a huge fan of women in medicine, an underrepresented group. And so the fact that I could draw attention to a woman in medicine, and a woman in medicine at that time, in the 30s in Poland, she was overcoming not just the hurdle of being Jewish with the numerus clausus, but being a woman studying the sciences and pursuing a course in medicine. So she herself addresses this double problem, which I find fascinating. Larry?
Female doctors in Auschwitz-Birkenau have written that they were often asked to accompany SS men during selections in the barracks, and they have written that they would choose the prisoners whom they thought were on the verge of death anyway. They knew that the people they were choosing were going to the gas chamber. Do we know if Esther knew that people being transported out of the Lodz ghetto were being sent to their death rather than to labor camps, which is the story the Germans were telling?
Okay, just based on the last thing, the story the Germans were telling, in some cases, they were actually sent to labor camps. As far as I can tell from this testimony, and I have to spend more time with the Shoah Foundation testimony, as far as I can tell, she was not on one of the commissions for doctors who performed examinations on people on transport lists. So that's an important fact. As for her level of awareness of what was happening to the people who left the ghetto, I'm not sure when she came to the awareness that these people just don't come back. That's unclear. But she does talk about the horrific kinder action, the Nazis going in and taking out all the children in September 42, and the elderly, and clearing out the hospitals and the violence. So there's a sense that there's a major danger, but I don't know for sure. But in my dissertation, I address those doctors, and what's fascinating is that some of them didn't want to get involved in the process in the first place, and they were presented with, if I may, a choiceless choice. They could not do anything, which would mean the SS doctor would pick at random who was going to the gas chamber, because X number of people had to come out of the hospital. And that meant maybe some people who had a chance of surviving. A person who was 1 day away from release because she was getting better. Maybe that person would be sent to the gas chamber, whereas other people who were about to die would be left there. So that was one option. The other option was actually participating in these selections, knowing who was going to die of quote-unquote natural causes, very close to death, and they had no chance of recovery, so picking them. But that was actually acting. So I'd like to put your term out there. You have to let me know whether I'm conceiving of it correctly.
So far, you're doing fine.
Okay. Woo! Very relieved there. Okay. We can talk after if there are criticisms. Okay.
So I'm interested in how you conceptualize resistance, because in this concentration-era universe, all these ethical terms are up for grabs, and so I'm interested in what your working definition of, if you have one, of resistance.
Well, I believe the term has been deployed a bit too much when it comes to the extreme of breathing was resistance because they were staying alive and the Nazis wanted to kill them all. So I back away from that extreme. I also back away from the extreme that the definition of resistance has to be armed resistance. So I'm in from the extremes, and so that much I can say. I've carved out what's still a really large area. I eliminate the acts of resistance that are perceived by others, but the person engaged in whatever act did not think of his or her action as resistance. I look at it as something that someone took agency to resist. There had to be an awareness of it. So
Self-awareness.
yes, thank you. Self-awareness. So that's one way. And generally, for me, it's a self-aware act that in some way, to some extent, would thwart Nazi aims. So that's my working definition. Thanks.
So you talked a little bit about, during your lecture now, you talked a little bit about the interview process itself and the interactions between the interviewer and the witness. And I kind of wanted to hear what you had to say about that in relation to the spectrum of coercion and resistance that you're talking about, because it seems as if that had a very large connection, like not only in the fact that the interviewer seemed to breach Fortunoff protocols and ask for this kind of judgment, but also the perhaps resistance that the witness kind of portrayed within the interview itself.
So one thing that I had as I was looking through the testimony, I believe they were Joanne's notes. And in brackets, in many places along the way, the comments were like, he's not supposed to ask that. How is the witness supposed to know the answer to this big historiographical question? And I could feel the frustration. I'm assuming it's you.
Probably.
Yeah. Just like, what is this guy doing? He is actively inserting himself. He is asking these big questions that someone in her own life, that's what she's the expert on. That's what she's there to talk about. But he was like, oh, yeah, I read that the Germans had this in mind from the beginning. Well, good for you. But this is about Esther. So it was frustrating for me, and I felt for Joanne through those notes that she probably wanted to reach her hand through the screen and I don't know what. He as far as I can recall, he didn't engage once she put that double bookkeeping out there. That was a point. He didn't latch onto that. I would need to watch the whole thing in its entirety again, but I'm not sure whether he asked, oh, was there resistance? Based on what I've pulled, he seemed to be more fixated on the idea of the collaboration. But that's a really interesting point. And another thing to say in terms of my construction of this spectrum model, based on what he's showing, I think he's nowhere near that conceptual point of nuance. He just simply is not there. So, I can't really bring it into his universe because he's just not on it.
I think we're going to have to. One more question.
Okay. Were the prisoner doctors, I sympathize for the decisions that they had to make at times. And I was wondering if they were sufficiently valuable enough to the Germans that they were treated in a way to keep them alive.
That's a great question. It depends on the camp. It depends where, when. Generally, they had extra food. In some cases, that was prescribed, extra rations to keep them alive to do their doctorly thing. In other cases, it was they ate the food for prisoners who couldn't eat it. And they also shared it with people in the barracks. So generally, they were pretty well fed. Just the fact that they worked inside as opposed to on an outside labor commando, that kept them alive longer to do what they were doing. And because they didn't work under the cruel, watchful eye of a horrible capo, they were generally under the watch of a head doctor, whether it's a Jewish doctor or not. The business within these, they were called hospitals or clinics or, Yes, that's the term that comes up. I'm trying, and Häftlingskrankenbauer, Krankenbauer, KB. So, yeah. So I'm just trying to translate the different meanings. So they weren't exposed to the same kind of violence. So how conscious of a decision that was on the part of camp leadership, I can't tell you. But it was a fact that they were spared some of the disastrous, horrific circumstances that the average prisoner had to confront.
I just want to address this point. I think the most important thing you said was at the beginning. It depended when and where, because plenty of doctors were selected as soon as they arrived for death, even though they were known to be physicians. And it just depended where and when.
Maybe on the supply of them too.
No, it's just what was happening at that moment in time. It's so random. It's not systematic. We always think that the Nazi regime was rational, systematic. It was not. It was actually quite chaotic.
Not in the Warthegau when it came to doctors.
Depends.
Right.
Depends.
So
But,
yes.
I've seen testimonies of people whose parents were physicians.
Yes.
And the person selecting them knew they were physicians.
But
as
said
they
you're
got
too old. You've lived. There's one.
But they were sent to
Yeah.
death.
There's one testimony. I think her name is Gertrude Mosberg. She said, "Oh, but my father's a physician." Oh, how old is he? And she states the age. Oh, he's lived long enough. It's okay. So you're right. But at the same time, again, depending on when, if we're talking Birkenau, there was a stage when the SS physicians performing selections were told to spare the lives of Jewish doctors. And this was in 44 when labor was crucial. And those people were transferred from Birkenau to Monowitz to the other subcamps. So there was a concerted effort, and you could see in the documentation, this doctor is transferred on the order of the head physician, the head SS physician. So you're right, it changed, but there were attempts at systematizing the selection, the positive selection of doctors.
Okay, well, thank you, Sari.